All right, it's 2 o'clock, so we're going to get started because we have a wonderful session to bring to you today. So, good afternoon. My name is Allie Dowds, she, her pronouns, and I am the consultant for special populations at MBLC. I want to thank you all for attending today's session titled Welcoming Patrons Who Are Deaf, Hard of Hearing, or Late Deafened to Your Library. This session is part of MBLC's new 12-month series. Core Connections, Building Community Supports and Allyship at Your Library. We are so excited to kick off this series with our friends and partners at the Massachusetts Commissions for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. Jonathan Odell is a supervisor for communication access technology and training services, as well as a passionate advocate for ensuring spaces, programs, and services are fully accessible to persons who are deaf and hard of hearing. Jonathan has a lot to share and cover with you today. You will also have a chance to hear from Noelle Bach, who is the director of the Peabody Institute Library in Danvers. Noelle will share her experience executing an MBLC Access for All grant to improve library services and access for deaf and hard of hearing patrons. This session will run 90 minutes and is being recorded for anyone who cannot stay the whole time. I'll share the recording out later. Everyone is muted during this general presentation, but you may unmute during the Q&A, which will be at the end, or feel free to use the chat feature to submit questions or comments throughout. And with that, I'd like to welcome Jonathan. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here, and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for having me. There is a comment in the chat you might want to have a look at. I'm not sure I understand it correctly. Something about the captioning not being enabled when Otter AI is running or something.
Yeah, so the Commonwealth doesn't allow us to use other recording devices. So someone who signed in has an Otter AI going, so we just need you to not have that on, please. Thank you.
Okay, makes sense to me. The captions on Zoom are working fine. I can see them. That's what I'm going to be using myself. So hopefully we will be okay. I do try to, articulate when I speak so that people can understand me, which is kind of helpful in a presentation, right? So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedules. I mean, I know how busy people are today. It's after the holidays and people have a mountain of stuff to catch up on. So I really appreciate you being here. And I want to say a big thank you to Allie, who has been, pun intended, a fantastic ally in getting us all to work together and helping, bring more knowledge to the library systems in the Commonwealth. I have to say I'm a huge fan of anyone who works in a library and of libraries in general. So it gives me a lot of pleasure to be able to talk to you today. I am going to go at a pretty good clip, and hopefully I will not lose my voice because that did happen to me earlier this week. Hold on a moment. Let me just see why. Okay. All right. So the communication protocol is going to be simple. First, I have two cochlear implants myself, and cochlear implants help me to hear better. They help me to hear much better. They work much better for me than the hearing aids did that I used to have, but they don't fix hearing. Nothing really fixes hearing. So I don't necessarily always understand 100% of what people are saying to me. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And I have an agreement with Allie that she's going to monitor the chat. And if I am saying something and there's a question that's directly, urgently related to what I'm talking about, she's going to interrupt my wall of words so that I have the opportunity to respond to the question in the chat. Otherwise, we have some time built in towards the end. So I hope that we are okay with that. And now, really quickly, I wanted to tell you who the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing is. If you haven't heard of us before, we are a very small agency. I believe we're usually the smallest or the second smallest agency in the Commonwealth. I think the smallest one was actually the Office for Refugee and Immigrants. I don't know if it still is. We kind of tend to switch places. We've been around since 1985. We're celebrating our 40th anniversary this coming year. And actually, we have a couple different departments. We have social work, we have technology and training, which is pretty much me and three other people. And then we have our interpreter and card referral services department, who you would contact if you need to request for an event or for a meeting or something else, a sign language interpreter or a card provider. And card provider stands for communication access real-time translation. We actually have started calling that more like card captioner because most people get what captioning is. So we have started to transition from card provider to card captioner, just so you know what that is. And that is something that you would primarily use with hard of hearing people. And we have various different offices. And I wanted to give myself a shout out here. If anyone wants me to come to your individual facility, I can do that. Matter of fact, I'm doing the same presentation tomorrow at a local library that could not send their staff to this particular meeting, but have tomorrow available. So I am available to do on-site trainings as well. So who do we serve? We have 1.4 million people in mass, about 20% of any given population in the Commonwealth. So if you have 100 people in your town, 20 of them are going to be hard of hearing. That's the way it works. And that's actually a low ball estimate, in my personal opinion. Particularly communities that have a high percentage of older folks have a much higher percentage of hard of hearing and late deafened people living there. One thing that I did not know until I started doing research for this presentation specifically was the fact that about 50 to 65% of that huge number are people who are over the age of 60. That kind of shocked me a little bit. I didn't know it was that high. I assumed it would be pretty high, but that's actually pretty high. And culturally deaf people, and so we are the Mass Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, it's not one and the same thing. Culturally deaf people are not just hearing people who lose their hearing. It's a completely different perspective, and we are going to address that separately. But culturally deaf people make up a tiny percentage of all people with hearing loss in the Commonwealth, but they have very complex communication needs, so it's kind of important that we focus considerable efforts on that today. So, the Americans with Disabilities Act, you are probably all versed in this and have a good understanding of it, so I'm not going to belabor that too much. If you have individual questions, you can ask me these kind of questions, but we are covered from all different perspectives. One thing I want you to think about is that I have met people who work in libraries, who are employees of libraries, who themselves have hearing loss. Many of us are aging into disability. So me, I'm 62 now. I lost my hearing when I was 9 years old. So the majority of my life has been spent as a person with hearing loss. But I'm looking around myself, and people who were hearing when I started are now starting to come to me and say, "Hey, Jonathan, I need a hearing aid." So many people are starting to age into disability, and that includes people who work alongside us. So we don't just want to think about how do we make ourselves accessible to the people who are coming in, but also how can we use those same tools and those same approaches to make ourselves accessible to the people who are working alongside us, and who knows, possibly for ourselves in the future. So that's important. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that we rarely set out to be discriminatory. Very rarely. In my experience, and I've been working for the Commonwealth for 34 years now, most discrimination is unintentional, and it happens by omission or by not paying attention or by just keeping things going the way they've always been. So I'm a really big fan of annually looking at what you're doing and saying, hey, does this still meet the need? Is this still something people use? Is this still something that is helpful to people? And then asking, of course, the individuals themselves and say, hey, and of course, you have to ask the right people. You can't just ask anybody because everybody has their own opinion. You need to ask somebody who's got a broad overview of what the issues are, and then say to them, hey, how can we be more representative and more inclusive of other persons like yourself? And you have to do that from time to time so you become aware of what the trends are out there, what has changed out there. For example, many of you probably have heard about the TTY, or the teletypewriter for the deaf. That is pretty much a historical artifact at this point. Not many people are using that anymore. Everybody's switched over to video phones, which I'm going to be talking about very shortly. But these are the kind of things you want to be thinking about. We're also covered under Title II, state and local government, because if we're government funded and we're state funded, we have a legal obligation to make ourselves accessible, and we can be taken to court when we are not. And we're also covered under Title III, which is places of public accommodation, because a library, of course, is a place of public accommodation. So we have to be in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And again, it's not just about overt discrimination. It's about, discrimination or disadvantagement of people with disabilities by neglect. That happens a lot. So the expectations, I do have to say that in my experience, again, I can't necessarily back this up with hard figures, but I can tell you that deaf and hard of hearing people have been disadvantaged for such a long time and so routinely that they have stopped having any expectations. Or should I say, they have gotten used to not being accommodated, and they are getting angry about it, and they are starting to sue about it, which is also why I am working very much with law enforcement right now, because law enforcement also has been kind of dragging their heels a little bit in that department, and there have been some lawsuits. And part of what we do at the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, we don't like lawsuits. We consider lawsuits something that happens when people don't communicate and don't listen. So we like to prevent that. So last year, for example, in the law enforcement field, I trained 24,000 police officers. Yep, you heard that right, 24,000 police officers, because the lawsuits brought about a situation where we were made part of the core curriculum of the MPTC. Now, we don't want that to happen in libraries. We don't want libraries, which are places of learning, places of enrichment and growth, to be the target of lawsuits. But these days, deaf and hard of hearing people are kind of like fed up with not being, accommodated. So I'm happy that I know personally quite a few libraries who, out of their own volition, have taken really big steps in making themselves accessible. I really applaud that. And hopefully this presentation will help you go a little bit further along that way. Because of that, because of this expectation that they're going to be discriminated against, deaf people don't pay attention to what you're doing sometimes. So what you have to do is you have to like almost go up to somebody, shake them and say, hey, we're providing this. We're providing that for you. Please look here. We're providing ASL interpreters. We're providing CART. We're providing whatever the person needs for whatever the situation is. And this also brings up a little bit of a clash between my idealistic nature and what I would love to see happen in the Commonwealth and the real world. My idealistic nature is, sure, we should provide something for everybody all the time, regardless of whether we know they're coming or not. We should always have ASL interpreters. We should always have card captioners, right? That would be nice, but I'm also a realist. And I know that we live in a world where material resources are not unlimited. And also, I know from working at the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing that we have a limited number of ASL interpreters and card captioners even available. So if every library suddenly started making every program accessible 24/7, we probably wouldn't have enough interpreters for anything else or enough card captioners for anything else. Having said that, that's a delicate balance, because as I put in my presentation, which I for the most part ignore, but it's up on the screen right now, you can see you don't typically reach out to somebody in a wheelchair and say, hey, are you bringing your ramp with you? Are you bringing your bathroom with you? Are you bringing your XYZ with you? But that's exactly what people are doing when they're calling deaf and hard of hearing people and saying, hey, are you coming? Do you need reasonable accommodation? We shouldn't have to identify that we need something that day. It should be provided automatically. But again, this is the clash, the tension that we have between the ideal world and the not so perfect reality that we're dealing with. But one thing you should be doing is you should be making people hyper aware of what you are offering when you do offer it. So for accommodations that are always there, like a counter loop, like captioning, like automatic speech recognition, like listening devices, you should post those and post them prominently, because you are going to run into people who don't even know what those are. I'm always amazed at how little people do to educate themselves. I've run into hard of hearing people. They've had a hearing loss for 10 years. They've never heard of assistive listening systems. They don't know what the ADA is. They never heard of CART. So if you don't tell them that you have some of these accommodations, they're not going to know to ask for it, which then creates a kind of like a vicious cycle of nobody knowing anything or doing anything. But when you actually post this information, somebody might ask, oh, what's that? And then you get the chance to do what I normally do, which is you get to educate people and say, look, this is what this is. Why don't you try it on? And I have done this many, many, many thousands of times, and people's eyes always open up and they get all wide. And some people have started crying right in front of me, and they say, oh my God, I didn't know this existed. This is wonderful. So it's really helpful when you advertise everything you have and you tell people, hey, not only do we have it, but I can show you how to use it. So that's a really good thing to do. And these are some of the signs. So this is the interpreter sign. It means if you put this on a flyer, it means we are providing interpreters. Closed caption, we don't really have a sign for captioning in general. There was all sorts of discussions about that. But if you put CC there, people are going to understand that this is something that you plan to caption. And then, of course, we have the other sign, assistive listening systems available. And I do want to clarify that you are under no obligation to provide a particular assistive listening systems. I don't want to go too far into that because we don't have enough time for that, but there are some people who will come to you and say, hey, you must provide a loop system for everything you do. And I'm always the first one to say, no, that's not true. If you have an FM system or you have a Wi-Fi based system or you have anything else, as long as it brings your voice to multiple listeners and it is categorized as an assistive listening system, nobody can tell you what assistive listening system you must provide, just that you have to provide one. And you should advertise that you're providing one so people know that you're doing that so they can come to your presentations. All right. Deep breath. So the next part, we're going to talk a little bit about self-identification. So when people use the word deaf, many people use the word deaf. People who should never call themselves deaf call themselves deaf. I know people who have very mild hearing losses who say, I'm deaf, which in the grand scheme of things doesn't help anybody because we don't have a real definition of what deaf is. So deaf is also a pathological and medical word. It denotes usually the absence of the ability to hear. And while that may be true for hard of hearing or late deafened people, it is not necessarily true for culturally deaf people who don't view themselves even as people with disabilities. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And in my next slide, I'm going to show you how we actually self-identify ourselves. We use ability and communication-based language and views to illustrate what we are. So, for example, people get confused with me because I'm pretty much everything. I do that on purpose. I confuse people, right? Because there are days when I don't have my implants on. Then I become culturally deaf. I communicate with other people in sign language, and I don't need to have the cochlear implants on or need to understand other people. But when I have them on, I try to speak and to hear what other people are saying to me. So I am a deaf person some days when if I get my implants, which has actually happened to me, I've gone into the bathroom and gone, oh my God, I don't have my ears on. I was deaf, I couldn't hear anything. Other times I am hard of hearing, which means I may struggle in complex environments, but usually understand you pretty well the rest of the time. In even other environments, the listening scenario is so challenging that even my cochlear implant enhanced hearing will not deliver enough information to me so that I can follow everything that's being said, in which case I will require captioning, which kind of puts me over into the late deafened category, which means somebody who really doesn't benefit enough from hearing aids to be able to understand a conversation. And this may seem a little bit nitpicky, but if you take this to heart, and I'm going to go over all of these in a moment, but if you take this to heart and somebody comes to you and they're actually using the correct terminology and they're saying, I'm deaf, or I'm hard of hearing, or I'm late deafened, it'll give you an idea of what you can do to help that particular individual. The golden rule with this kind of situation is always ask the person. And we've gotten to the point where we sometimes politely sit around the table and nobody wants to say anything because, oh, God forbid, we offend somebody. But I will tell you, I have never met a person who is offended when you say to them, I really want to have us to have perfect communication. What do you need from me? How can I help you? And people are flattered by that. I can tell you that. People have told me many times that they're flattered by that. People have also told me they're flattered by the fact that I give them my undivided attention. And at the back of my head, I'm thinking, well, I have to because otherwise I wouldn't understand you. So really, it's really, really a wonderful thing when you ask somebody. There's a wonderful expression in the disability community, nothing about us without us, which kind of applies to everything we do here and also applies to talk to somebody. Don't make assumptions because even if you have two culturally deaf people in front of you or five hard of hearing people, one person is going to be different from the next. Everybody is going to be an individual, just like all of you are individuals. And it wouldn't occur to me to treat you all the same. So always ask a person, what do you need from me? What can I do for you? Now, let's have a look at some of these individual categories. So what's a culturally deaf person? A culturally deaf person is generally speaking somebody who has been brought up in an ASL environment. Now, I could have said somebody who was brought up by deaf people. No, not necessarily. 9 out of 10 deaf children are born to hearing parents. That is a interesting statistic that most people don't know. Most of you probably have heard of Alexander Graham Bell, and Alexander Graham Bell was an individual who was married to a deaf woman, and that's why he invented the telephone. Fun fact, he invented the single most discriminatory device ever invented to help his deaf wife. Fun fact. One not so fun fact about him is that in the days before genetics, he thought deafness was a horrible, terrible thing, and he was advocating for the sterilization of deaf people in the belief that this would stop deaf children from being born. And he completely ignored the fact, because he didn't know it, that 9 out of 10 deaf children are born to hearing parents. So that's a fun fact for you that's not in this presentation. And I am not here to besmirch anyone's memory, but I just want to make it clear that just because somebody was born deaf and brought up in ASL does not mean they had deaf parents. Uh, in fact, many of the deaf people that I know were raised by hearing parents, some of which learned sign language, some of which did not, which to me seems incomprehensible. But there are many hearing parents who, while they encourage their child to learn ASL in school and might even send them to schools where ASL is taught or provide them with aids in that kind of a setting, they will not necessarily learn ASL at home. So that's the kind of environment we're talking about. But it's generally somebody whose first language is American Sign Language. American Sign Language has nothing to do with English, absolutely nothing. And the biggest mistake I see over and over and over again are people who write something complicated down or provide a thick sheet of written documentation to a deaf person and go, there, I'm done. I do not have to provide an ASL interpreter. And that's absolutely wrong, because there's no guarantee that this, what you're providing to the deaf person, is going to be understood by the deaf person, because they may not read English, have the same English comprehension level that you and I do. It depends again on the individual. There are some culturally deaf people who are fantastic and phenomenal in written English. Spoken English, probably not, but written English, yes. But you cannot make that assumption. You always have to ask, what is your comfort level with English before you give somebody something in English and assume that that's going to take care of it. Back when we still had office hours, we would have people show up constantly in our office pointing to something, go, I don't understand this. Can you please help by interpreting this for me? And it would be documents from Social Security or from some other state office, and it was written in state English, which I sometimes have difficulty understanding. And they were expecting a deaf person to be able to read that and understand it, and you can't do that. So ASL is not universal. It is used in America, hence the name. If you go to Canada, you're going to have Canadian Sign Language. If you go to England, you're going to have British Sign Language. If you go to Austria, you're going to get Austrian Sign Language. If you go to Germany, you get German Sign Language, even though the spoken languages might be the same. So ASL also varies slightly by region, which comes into play a little bit later again, which I'm going to explain. But it is a real language. It is not just some made up thing. It is a very real language and it evolves over time. You can see some of the technology today that's available, like internet and video phone and stuff like that. These signs came about when the technology came about. They didn't exist before. So the languages have changed over time. Um, so again, remember, providing complex materials in written English is not always acceptable. You ask the person, can you understand this? Does this help you? Then they say yes, then you're okay. But if they say no, or I need an interpreter to understand that, depending on what it is, of course, then you might have to make that accessible for them. And what is an ASL interpreter? That's the other pet peeve I have. One of my pet peeves is when for example, I went to a parent-teacher conference with my stepson, and I asked for an ASL interpreter. And instead of providing me with an ASL interpreter, I was provided with a student aide, somebody who was basically learning how to sign ASL. And instead of fluent ASL, that person was signing, which of course was not acceptable. So when you provide an interpreter, you can't just grab into your bag of tricks and get a local volunteer who you know took a sign language class or two. We're talking about a real certified, credentialed interpreter has to be made available if you are going to be providing an ASL interpreter. That's really important. We do not in Massachusetts have a licensure process for interpreters. So unfortunately, even today, people sometimes show up and say, oh yeah, I'm an interpreter, and you wouldn't necessarily know that. So it makes sense to only request interpreters from agencies such as ourselves, because we don't even employ ever people who are not certified and qualified interpreters, which are essential to transmitting the meaning both ways. Ah, yes, there's a strict code of professional conduct, which includes also an interpreter is there to interpret. If you have questions about how to accommodate a deaf person or what to do in this particular meeting, do not ask the interpreter. Ask the deaf person who is there, because that's the person who is the boss, so to speak. The deaf person makes decision where they're going to sit, where they want the interpreter to be, and you need to get that information from the deaf person. People sometimes have a bias, an unconscious bias, where they go up and talk to the interpreters because, of course, the interpreters are going to understand them. And when you do that, you're disempowering the deaf person, and the deaf person is standing there scratching their head and going, why is the library person talking to the interpreter? And I don't know what's going on. So it's really important to empower the deaf person by talking directly to the deaf person. Reserve front row seating for deaf and hard of hearing people. It's really important that any kind of events you have a sight line. An interpreter is going to be completely useless if the deaf person can't see them. And putting somebody 3 or 4 rows back in a larger event is going to make it difficult for them to see the interpreters and for the interpreter to see the deaf person when they're signing a response or any kind of a question. So you do have to think about seating arrangements for not just people with mobility issues, but also for people who may be deaf and hard of hearing. You may need more than one interpreter. You may need 2 interpreters. You may actually need more than 2 interpreters if you have a deaf person, a deaf blind person, or somebody who requires a certified deaf interpreter. I don't want to intimidate you, but yes, you may sometimes have to provide more than one interpreter. If your presentation is, say, an hour long, one interpreter is not enough. You usually have to provide 2 interpreters. And then if you have somebody with an additional need, like a certified deaf interpreter, and they've asked for that, which is somebody who doesn't really understand ASL, but depends on visual gestural communication, you might have to add a certified deaf interpreter, which is a deaf individual who works together with an ASL interpreter to transmit the meaning back and forth. And that's actually what you see when you see the governor giving a speech at the State House or any kind of an announcement. You see the governor speaking, and next to the governor is an interpreter. And that interpreter is, for the most part, not a hearing interpreter. This is a deaf interpreter who is getting their information from an interpreter who is in the audience, who is listening to the governor, signing everything in ASL, and then the CDI receives that and retransmits it in a richer, fuller, visually gestually inclusive, more visual version of American Sign Language that even people who are not natively fluent in ASL can understand. Wow, I did a good job explaining that. I'm proud of myself. I usually stumble all over that because really that's not the easiest thing in the world to explain. But if you have questions, email me. We're happy to help. And yes, we do provide certified deaf interpreters as well. So basically, as much information as you can give us about the event and who is expected to attend, and has anybody asked you anything special, share that with us, and we can then tell you what you need to do. We make it easy for you. We really do. So, yeah, provide advanced prep. English has what? I think 75,000 words in common usage. ASL is a language of, I believe, 4,000 distinct hand shapes. I believe. Don't quote me on that. I could be wrong about that. But the point of that being, again, often interpreters have to use similar hand shapes or have to fingerspell something. And to do that on the spot is a little bit hard depending on what is being talked about. So if you're talking about neurobiology, you're going to have a lot of words like this, and the interpreter will not have ready-made any kind of a interpretation for that. They're probably going to have to fingerspell it or come up with some way of signing it, and they can't usually do that on the fly. So it's really important to give anybody prep. And if you're going to have a captioner for hard of hearing people, they also need to come up with a dictionary, and that dictionary has to be pre-assigned so that a provider knows what keystrokes to hit in order to have one of those really long words come up. Otherwise, they have to finger write everything, which is pretty arduous. Now, I've talked about this a little bit already, so I can save you all the time, but not everybody who is deaf knows American Sign Language. ASL, people have the strangest ideas about ASL. They think somebody goes to bed and they're perfectly hearing. They wake up, they're deaf, and suddenly they know ASL too. And that's not how it works. You know, it would be nice if we could all learn that way, right? I'd take my big map or put it under my pillow, sleep, and in the morning I'm a mathematical genius. But that's not actually how it works. ASL is a language that has to be learned by deaf people and by hearing people alike. So if you have a deaf person who's never been exposed to ASL, like they moved to the United States or they were neglected and abandoned and didn't have the opportunity to participate in a school system that recognized their needs and taught them American Sign Language, they will not know ASL. So in that case, again, you need to get a certified deaf interpreter. And we actually have quite a few people and quite a few requests every year for certified deaf interpreters. Most of the time, when you see videos coming out from the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, announcements on our Facebook page or whatnot, they are signed by a certified deaf interpreter for that reason, to be universally inclusive. Yep. And something else that I think is important when you're interacting with deaf people, and it's more important for some other populations, for example, with law enforcement, it's really, really important that you understand that deaf people have different ways of communicating. So the easiest way for me to say this is that when a deaf person grows up in a deaf environment, they're not going to say, excuse me, to each other because nobody will hear, nobody will respond. So it becomes cultural norm behavior that deaf people will tap the table, or they will flick a light switch, or they will go, hey, 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 to get your attention, or they will come up to you and they will tap you on the shoulder or tap you on your knee or whatnot. And that is something that here we don't typically do, and we're not typically, in fact, here we go in the opposite direction. I myself am kind of a second generation American, I suppose, or no, rather first generation. I moved here from another country, and I noticed very early on that America was not very touchy-feely, very open, but people don't like to be touched. People have an extreme personal space here in the United States, so people often react negatively when they are touched. and make all sorts of assumptions. And I want to assure you, when a deaf person touches you to get your attention, their only intent is to get your attention. But people don't know that. And when somebody's coming up into your personal space and they're acting differently than what you are accustomed to, people sometimes are shocked by that. And then that can cause a negative reaction. And then things can snowball. And in law enforcement, it's a bit more serious. I can't remember in 34 years ever having heard of something negative like that happening in a library environment. But then again, I haven't been to all the libraries. I haven't heard all of your stories. So I just wanted to let you know that this behavior is normal, and deaf people don't, for the most part, speak. They sign, and when you don't speak, your emotions, what's going on with you, is carried in your body. So when I'm angry, for example, my voice is going to be a little bit harsh, and my eyebrows are going to go up a little bit, and you're going to hear it in me. When a deaf person gets angry, it's going to look very intense. They're going to look like that. And that's perfectly normal and really doesn't mean anything. But try telling that to somebody who sees that for the first time. It's like, whoa, I had that reaction. And it took me a while to get used to say, oh, I get it. Because they don't speak, they're showing me their reaction. So please be prepared for that. It does not indicate bad behavior. If somebody speaks too loud, similarly, let me switch for a moment from deaf to hard of hearing. Hard of hearing people speak loud. Does it mean they're angry? No. It means they often cannot modulate the sound of their own voices because they can't hear themselves. So they speak too loud, which has nothing to do about being disrespectful or disturbing the peace or anything other than that they cannot hear themselves. So it's kind of the same idea. All right. Ah,
Jonathan,
yes.
it's Allie. So I just want to give you the nudge that it's 2:35. I know we were going to pass it to Noel around this time. So it's just giving you the
Yeah,
heads
I'm
up.
almost done with my section. Thank you. I'm actually rushing through this. I'm very proud of myself for doing excellently well, I can tell you. But I wanted to say really quickly, do not use, if you have a deaf person and they're bringing a hearing kid with them, do not use that hearing kid to be that deaf person's interpreter. That is not okay. It's okay to do little informal things here and there, but definitely not for a presentation or for a formal meeting or anything like that. So, and also one wonderful thing to do, and I believe Noel's going to talk a little bit about that, is that what you should be doing is you should be considering posting things that you are going to do for deaf and hard of hearing people on your website in the form of an ASL video so that the deaf person knows beforehand what to expect and doesn't have to read through a whole bunch of incomprehensible English. So at this point, before I go into the technology, I'm going to turn it over to Noel. So Noel, take it away.
Let me unmute myself. Hi, everybody. Glad that you could be with us today. So I'm just going to talk very briefly, as Ali said, here in Danvers. When I first started 4 years ago, I was given a message through a friend that the New England Homes for the Deaf, which we have one of these in Danvers, did not feel welcome in the library, which as a librarian, is just like a dagger to your heart that, somebody doesn't feel welcome. And so that kicked off me applying for the grant, an Access for All grant, so that we could focus on reaching out to the deaf and hard of hearing community in our town of Danvers. So that's kind of like where the genesis of this started. And so I am aware that like every library is not going to have funds to do everything that I'm going to briefly talk about. But I just want to give you some experiences, and I'm going to touch on some of the things that Jonathan just talked about, sort of expand about it, on how our experience was here in Danvers. So we did a 2-year grant, and just he's going to launch into a minute here into some more of the technology pieces. But what we did our first year is try to focus on technology and training for staff. And one of the things that I'm sure Jonathan will talk a little bit more about, and he already referenced it a little bit, is counter loops. And so counter loops, they're not that expensive. They're a little under $400 a piece, which might be expensive for some people, but they're literally just a standalone little thing. You just keep it plugged in, and it is for hard of hearing people who, if they have a hearing aid that has a T-coil in it, which I know that Jonathan and I, when we spoke earlier, not all hearing aids do have the T-coil, so there is limited, everything that we're going to talk about, there's limits to everything. There is nothing that you're going to ever get that's going to cover everybody. And that's part of the issues. But we do have at every service desk, and our community outreach person also has one to take on the road with her, a counter loop. It's not very large. And it's just on all the time. And it basically, if a person turns their hearing aids to T, then it amplifies whoever is speaking for them and into their hearing aid. So it's a great little thing. And I am a big proponent of having something like that because it's very simple. And once you plug it in, you don't have to do anything with it. But some of the other things that we got at the time, like after looking into what kind of things, and we did talk, so because we do have the New England Homes for the Deaf here, we did reach out to them, form a connection with them, and we worked a lot with them directly via surveys and just discussion about what kind of things they needed or wanted from the library. And so and we did have representative from there come and do a training directly for my library staff about deaf culture and communicating with people who are deaf. We also reached out to Northeast ARC. And so a lot of you should have an ARC somewhere near you. And they came, for free and also did a disability training with my staff. And they worked with because this also encompasses people with different disabilities who are nonverbal. So these are all things that are going to help. So one of the things that New England Homes for the Deaf representative Tom Boudreau told us is that you don't need ASL, right? And as Jonathan just said, ASL is awesome to have, but it is a language. It is a language that you have to learn and keep up with. And you can't just be like, hey, great. I've taken a few classes, or my staff's taken some classes. If they're not using it every single day, you're not going to hold on to it like any other language. So it's great to learn some signs. And there's in transparent languages actually is a great library focused ASL course on there as well that I've done a bunch of. But ASL is not going to be a catch-all for you for talking to a lot of people that are deaf. However, they are willing, as Jonathan's saying, there are lots of ways to communicate. And so we bought whiteboards for every desk so that even though not everybody might also be able to read, that is also a factor. Having something simple like a whiteboard for every desk that you can use with any person who might be nonverbal or deaf or hard of hearing that you can write out and then give it to them and let them write back, that's a communication method that I think everybody should be able to afford and have at their library desks. We also have those communication books where you have a lot of different pictures. So you can do pointing to pictures and let them point to pictures to try to communicate as well. And as Tom told us from New England Homes for the Deaf, he's like, pantomiming, doing your best just to however you want to try to communicate. People who are deaf, as Jonathan said, are used to not having anything where they're going. They're not used to having someone who knows ASL. They're not used to having the services. And so they have learned, and the burden shouldn't be all on them, but but they have learned to cobble together ways to communicate. And as Jonathan was also saying, if people who are deaf will do different ways to try to get your attention, and you do need to look at them, focus right on them, and work through it. And he said everyone's willing. If you're willing to work on it and they're willing, you will be able to figure out a way to communicate. So doing things like, my whole staff needs to learn ASL. That's not going to work. You're going to have turnover. A lot of that's not going to work long term. So what you really need to do is focus on simple methods. And this is all just coming from our experience. And we have a deaf community in our town. A lot of other places, maybe you have a handful of deaf people in your town who may never come to your library. And so, spending the time and money learning ASL is going to be of limited use to you. But having communication books that will work not only for deaf, but, for other people who are nonverbal who might be coming into your library is great. And, whiteboards, markers. I mean, you can get other fancy, there's a lot of technology that I'm sure Jonathan will talk about that you can also get, but those aren't always going to be practical for every library or affordable for every library as well. But there are simple things like that you can do. Then I want to just touch on, so that was kind of our first year. We did training and buy some tech things, but our second year was focusing on programming and having ASL interpreters come in for some of our programming. And again, like we use surveys to talk to the New England Homes for the Deaf to see like what kind of things they might be interested in. And we tried to pick big popular programs that we thought anybody would be interested in, to try to have interpreters. So to Jonathan's point, again, you need lead time if you're going to ask for interpreters from the commission. It's a simple form to fill out, very easy. But as he said, you're going to need, if it's 45 minutes an hour, you have to have 2 interpreters. Like you can't just have one. And when you put your request in, they want as much information as you can give them. And I actually would end up having conversations back and forth with the person trying to place people, because things that you want to know is like, is the presenter going to have slides? Can they have access to the slides in advance so that they can prepare for their signing? I was often connecting interpreters and presenters together beforehand so that they could ask some questions. And even things like that, like where could they stand in the room? If they're going to have a presentation show video or slides, do they need the room dark? Well, they can't have the room dark if you're going to have an interpreter. Like there are things like that you kind of have to think through in advance and work with the interpreters for as well. Again, one of the other things is that you are going to usually be hiring at least 2 interpreters. And it's also at their fee rate, and everybody has a different fee rate depending on their certification, because there are different levels of certification for interpreters too. They also have to charge you for at least 2 hours. So even though it's only a 1-hour program, they are charging you for 2 hours. So these are all just things to build in your head. So when you're thinking about doing this, that you're properly kind of preparing for it as well. Now, we had several programs, just checking my notes, we had several programs, where we did have interpreters, present. Some of them actually very nicely, our local cable access came and filmed as well. So that made it a nice, an even extra accessible program. So that could be on video and be interpreted. So that was really, really wonderful whenever you do that. And the interpreters will trade off with each other. They'll make their own deal with each other when they're there to decide how they're going to interpret the program. But we did several, and it was one of those things where I was expecting to spend more money on it than I needed. Like I expected it to be more expensive than it was. So it's actually very reasonable cost wise. And one of the things we only did a couple of programs where we did the CART interpretation, which is what you're doing for virtual programs. And I know some people are trying to get by like, oh, Zoom has, captions or whatever. CART's very different. It is, much better. It is certified. It is more in depth. It is more expensive to have too. And one of the things that I've talked to a few people about, and I think that we should push forward when we do have these shared programs that are virtual between libraries, and we have, we're all sharing some of the cost to make it affordable. We should really be, if we can, trying to get a CART interpreter for those as well, and just share the cost of that out, because we should be, if we can, be sharing out the cost and making things as accessible as possible when we can too. So that's something I'm just throwing out there in the ether for people to start thinking about doing. But you do need lead time. So one of the other difficulties with getting interpreters for your programs is that you do need lead time, at least 2-3 weeks minimum, someone is out there at the commission working on finding somebody for your programs. You might not know until you get much closer to your program whether or not you have interpreters for your program. So that can be a little difficult, because you don't want to advertise you have interpreters if you don't have interpreters confirmed, but you might not know until pretty late in the game that you do have confirmed interpreters. So that can be a little bit of a tricky piece to work with. As well. So it's just something else to keep in mind. And as Jonathan said, there are only so many interpreters out there. So you cannot be guaranteed that just because you put a request in that it is going to get filled. But however, I did talk to many interpreters. I worked with many of them over the last year. And, once you've made a connection with a lot of, and some of them were more local to us, and they said, you can reach out to us directly as well, to see if we have availability. once once you've made a connection with them. But that is at your own discretion, obviously. And like I mean, I liked working through the commission because then I was sure of who I was getting and what that I knew that they'd be people that were vetted and certified as well. So kind of my wrap up, I guess, to all of that is that the most important pieces, I think, for me were just that we had training for my staff just to, and obviously Jonathan is willing to come and talk to you about that at your library. And said, like, I had someone from New England Homes for the Deaf do it. And, I only slightly insulted Jonathan that I didn't ask him. But but even if you have Northeast ARC or different ARC group, to come in and just talk to your staff about working with people with disabilities and how to communicate with people with different disabilities, that is hugely valuable for your staff and raises their comfort level so much to be able to work through, using a communication method. So you don't need to get hung up on all of these other ways to communicate. But I do strongly say, after I've gone through these last couple of years, is that, if you can afford it, having counter loop systems and definitely having communication boards or books that you can have at your service points makes a huge difference, and just is doing, I think, the very least that we should be able to do. And if you have more questions about that, I am always happy to answer anybody's questions. Feel free to email me, and we'll have time for questions at the end, or put things in the chat as well. And I'm gonna I was trying to keep it quick because I know Jonathan has a lot more.
Thank you, Noelle. Thank you so much. Back to you, Jonathan, now that you've had a little bit of a break. And Noelle, seriously, that was a really nice just personal experience to share with the group and to connect to everything that Jonathan is sharing today.
Yes, and Noelle was great. Noelle was really, really good. Thank you, Noelle, for jumping in and mentioning your experience. I'm just going to correct one thing, which is one of my pet peeves. There is no such thing as a card interpreter. There's an ASL interpreter and there's a card captioner. And I get really pedantic about this because I get people calling me, where do I get a loop FM system? And I'm like, what the heck is that? I've never heard of a loop FM system, because a loop system is one thing, an FM system is another. If you're using them both together, nobody knows what you're talking about. So Noelle was phenomenal, and I highly
apologize
encourage
for
you
my
to do
mistake.
everything that Noelle said, except ASL interpreter and card captioner, two different populations entirely. ASL only works for culturally deaf people, which in the Commonwealth, we tried to do an estimate once, somewhere between 36 and 56,000. Hard of hearing people, over 1.3 million. So I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I'm going to say, particularly in the more remote areas of the Commonwealth, I wouldn't say remote, or the more rural areas, deaf people tend to congregate in large communities because the access is better. There's more accessible things happening in Boston than there are for, I don't know, I can't even think of a town right now. Let's say Kingston, because I used to live in Kingston. Kingston, Massachusetts is a great place to live. I live now in Millis, Massachusetts, and there's not a whole lot of things for culturally deaf people happening here, but there's a lot of hard of hearing people here. So you have to kind of aim your efforts at who your audience is. It wouldn't make sense if here in Millis, everything was ASL captioned. Paul, I'm making a mistake. See, Noelle, it's all your fault. So basically, if you made every program here in Millis ASL accessible, it would be completely useless, because we have, I think, in the entire community, I've seen maybe one deaf person, maybe two. So it would be a complete waste of your time, efforts, and money. So you do have to understand your audience, exactly what Noelle said. All right, let me go on quickly. I want to talk about the technology just a little bit. From two perspectives: A, what are people going to do to reach you? And B, what can you do to maybe invent yourself as a demonstration center? Because some libraries have done that, and I'm thinking that that's the most awesome thing I've ever seen, is that some libraries actually have demonstration devices so they can help educate the community on what you have. As I said earlier, if you have an assistive listening system and you give this to somebody, their eyes are going to go big. They might start crying, oh my God, why didn't I know about this? And then you can show them this, and you can tell them where to get it. Wow, you've just changed this person's life. So not only are video phones, for example, let me make sure that I get there. Video phones are basically the same idea as a smartphone or a tablet with a front-facing camera and speaker and all that, and they have special apps. You cannot get a video phone app and you cannot get a video phone without being a certified deaf person who uses ASL, and the FCC mandates that a deaf person be identified and registered as a user because the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, is what pays for the interpreters. So basically, if you were to call a deaf person, you could use any phone, any regular phone. You call the VP number, the video phone number of the deaf person, and a federally funded interpreter pops up on their end and signs to them on their video phone what you're saying to them. And then when you speak back, takes their sign and speaks to you. So that's what most people use. So you don't necessarily have to have a TTY anymore. If you want to keep a TTY, by all means, keep a TTY. But just so you know, most deaf people themselves do not use TTYs anymore. So for those of you who are going to contact me and say, where can I buy a TTY? I would recommend that unless you happen to know somebody who specifically has one, you don't bother with them. And if you want language that you can use in your publications, please contact me. I can help you with that. But this is what most deaf people use today is a video phone. Video remote interpreting is something you can use when you cannot get an interpreter to be there. And yes, video remote interpretation can be used for virtual meetings because you can add an ASL interpreter as a participant, and then you can spotlight them so that the deaf person who is participating in the virtual event can see the ASL interpreter. Now, I will say that in a live event, it's best to have an interpreter there, but if you can't, it's also possible to quote unquote beam in an interpreter as long as they can hear the audio crystal clear and as long as they can be heard by everybody in the audience and seen by the deaf people in the audience. And again, I can help you with that kind of a setup. You can have interpreters join a live meeting remotely. That is possible. So, an accessible video conference, and this is just giving you an example of what you just saw about spotlighting. It's exactly the same thing with deaf people. But one thing you can't do in a video conference is have a deaf person have to go like this to find their interpreter every time. It has to be spotlit. All right, now let's talk about hard of hearing people, which make up the majority of people. First of all, the most important thing that I got to tell you is hearing loss is not just about volume. When you lose your hearing, part of the nervous apparatus, the nerves in the ear die or they become damaged. So it's not just a matter of volume amplification. It's a matter of no matter how loud somebody speaks to you or you speak to them, they may not understand you. Wenn ich jetzt zum Beispiel anfange, Deutsch zu sprechen, werden Sie wahrscheinlich nicht verstehen, was ich sage. Stimmt? How many of you heard me? You all heard me. This is a great trick. I love doing this in the middle of presentations. I burst out in German and people are like, what did you say? I was speaking to you in another language, so clearly you heard me, but you didn't understand me. And this is hands down the best representation of what hearing loss is actually like. You hear people, but you don't understand them. So it's a matter of A, raising the volume, and B, enunciating, speaking clearly, and finding other methods to represent what is being said so that the very large number of hard of hearing and late deafened people who are going to be interacting with you can still understand you. One of the things I wanted to show you, and I don't have my self-view enabled for some reason, so I don't know if you can see this. Can you see this okay? Is this blurry or can you see it? It's sort of in between. What about now? Can you see it now? Is that better? So this is a tablet that I use for automatic speech transcription. So I would add to Noel's point, not only use whiteboards, but get yourself perhaps some iPads and enable live caption, or even better, get some Android tablets that are able to show live transcribe, which is a built-in transcription app, and have those in your front desk. So then you're covered between counter loops and between live transcription and all that. You will have some way of communicating with somebody. Let me go forward quickly. So you've all seen hearing aids. A hearing aid is a dead giveaway that somebody's got a hearing loss. I have never yet met somebody who wears a hearing aid without having a need for it. But you can't always see hearing aids, and don't make the assumption that because somebody wears hearing aid, they understand you perfectly. These, like cochlear implants, are tools. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. And what often happens is you have to look at the environment. For example, I've been in enough libraries to know that sometimes there's 3 or 4 people talking at the same time at the reference desk. That is extremely difficult for somebody with hearing loss because they're not just picking up you, they're picking up everybody around you. And we have very little control over what we hear. We cannot selectively tune out things. So also think about how you want to organize your space. If you can separate like one area from this area, and by causing physical separation, you're making it easier for somebody to be able to focus on you. So, yeah, get somebody's attention, face them, enunciate. Don't look down when you're talking to somebody. Look up when you're talking. Make sure you have direct line of sight. Um, for those of you who have big facial hair, trim it so that your lips are visible, because that's a really embarrassing situation for me when I have to try to understand somebody who's got a big beard. Um, and provide, again, listening systems and automatic speech recognition at the points of entry where it's easy to understand. You should have an assistive listening system, which I do want to say the counter loop, which I think I have a picture. Hold on. See, this here is a counter loop. The bottom device is a counter loop. It's awesome. It's got a little microphone in the back. When you speak into it, it will pick up your voice and it will send out an electromagnetic field that's going to be somewhere between 2 and 6 feet in circumference. And anyone within that area who has a telecoil will pick up that electromagnetic field and will hear your voice amplified over anything else in the area. So it helps to give targeted amplification. But it's not generally something that you want to be schlepping around from place to place. If you want to have an assistive listening device that you can take with you while you are mobile, I would not recommend the counter loop. I would recommend something like this, an assistive listening device, a personal one that consists of a little device such as this with a microphone on top, and the other person has the earbuds, and they can hold it themselves and point it at you so they understand you better. And sometimes you don't even need assistive devices, because sometimes when it's noisy and it's confusing, you can just say to somebody, hey, let's step into a more private, quiet office and have a conversation there, because that is going to make it much easier for them to understand. And yes, these slides will be available at the presentation. I actually just had to fix some alt text, so I'll make sure to get it all. But yes, and resources will be made available as well where you can buy this. And you're always free to email me, because I know we're covering an awful lot of information in a very short amount of time. But the counter loop is a great thing. And again, you may have to put a sign there to explain what it is, because most people have no idea what that is from looking at it. It's not like all these millions of people have any idea what they're doing. Most of these people have no clue about their own disability, which is really eye-opening for me, because I'm confronted with that every day. So you might actually have to educate them, which means you have to explain, hey, this is how that works. And then you ask, do you have a telecoil in your hearing aid? If so, maybe we can get this working for you. So you are going to have to do the educational bit as well. These are systems that you would use. These are wireless systems, which I'm sure you've all had them before, where you have a microphone here, you've got a belt pack transmitter, and then everybody has a receiver, and they can connect whatever and make it as loud as they want. And you can use these for language translation also. So they are pretty neat systems. They do require a little bit more installation and maintenance. I mean, not installation, but maintenance, because you got to charge the battery. You got to make sure you show somebody how to use it, blah, 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 blah. It's not necessarily the most labor unintensive method of doing things. And this here is a room loop. The difference between the counter loop and the room loop here is if you have a meeting room and you put a loop in there, then all you have to do is basically turn it on, and then anybody who speaks at the microphone will automatically, the loop will create an electromagnetic field that everyone within the looped area will be able to receive if, and that's a big if these days, if the hearing aids have telecoils in them. And there's a big argument between me and even the Hearing Loss Association of America that recommends every place be looped, because we're in a state of technological flux. Hearing aids are now starting to adapt more to the wireless environment like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. And the loop is actually a copper implement, a copper coil that goes inside a hearing aid. It's a physical construct. It's not expensive, but it takes up space. And when in a time when everybody's miniaturizing everything, not everybody puts teleloops in their hearing aids anymore. So it's a good idea to talk to your community and find out what they have. But this is something that once you install it, you set it and forget it. However, it's also pretty expensive to install. Unless you want to tape something down to the ground, which is really ugly, it usually is put in during the construction phase. So retrofitting it can be hideously expensive in some cases. Uh, Yes, that's true. That's true. But I have also seen people lose stickers. So it's a really good idea to actually make sure that you describe as well as possible what this is and how does it work. But I do highly recommend counter loops. They're very useful. We actually used them in the mass vaccination centers during the COVID epidemic because back then you couldn't pass anything back and forth, and those were completely hands-free. Very nice. The new developments now in the field are Wi-Fi based and Bluetooth based assistive listening systems. They show a lot of promise, but there we have the other problem, which is the hearing aids are just starting to come out now who have that functionality integrated. So if you're talking to somebody who got the hearing aids 4 years ago, they may not have Bluetooth, they may not be able to integrate with Wi-Fi. So you will still have to get receivers for the Bluetooth and the Wi-Fi and help them by giving them a neck loop that connects to the hearing aid, that connects to, it gets complicated. But again, you have me, so feel free to reach out to me and ask me questions about that kind of stuff. I can help you with that. But it's just that we live in a weird state of technological innovation and flux where it can be a little bit difficult to get everything right for everybody, as Noel said earlier. Overcast in particular is the up and coming thing, which is going to allow people with earpods, with smartphones, with hearing aids, with cochlear implants, even hearing people who have no hearing loss whatsoever, to all connect to the same audio stream. As far as I know, it is mostly being used in very public venues like train stations and airports and things like that. But it shows a lot of promise, and as of 2027, the standards are going to be final and locked down, and you can today already buy systems that utilize that. So this does not require that you put something in the walls or anything. It just requires a transmission friendly environment, whether that's Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. So there are some significant cost savings involved with that. Caption and amplified telephones are other things that both people with hearing loss use that you can make them aware exist. So, for example, there's something called the Mass Equipment Distribution Program, which I've highlighted in a link here. They actually will provide captioned and amplified phones free of charge to people with hearing loss if they go to the audiologist and get a certification. So you can make people aware of that, and you can also get a caption phone from the Mass Equipment Distribution for your library demonstration area, so you can show somebody how it works. All you need to do is have a landline, and you need to have access to a Wi-Fi, and they can give you an unrestricted CapTel phone that will help you make your library services more accessible by showing other people this is what you can use here. So now late deafened. What's a late deafened person? Is generally somebody who doesn't benefit from hearing aids at all anymore, or only for sound, or only for a very small percentage of spoken comprehension. These are people who, like me, use a cochlear implant for the most part, or if they don't have a cochlear implant, they're going to absolutely require captioning. Okay, an assistive listening system is probably not going to do it for them anymore. And forget personal amplifiers. Those don't even work for people who have hearing aids for the most part. They only work for mild to moderate hearing loss. Anything from moderate to severe, you need a hearing aid. And then you get people who are beyond severe, which is people like myself who are late deafened. They use cochlear implants or they have nothing, and you have to provide, basically for them, you have to provide communication access, real-time translation. So, full disclosure, my wife is actually a professional captioner. So, those of you who have worked with captioners may have worked with my wife without even knowing it. And what they do is they can come in, or they can do this remotely as long as they can hear the audio stream. They will write on a stenotype machine everything they're hearing, and they are very fast. My wife can write about 320 words a minute with a 98% accuracy rate. And that output can be projected onto a wall, onto a screen, can be sent to somebody who is in the room through a private URL, can be provided remotely. It is awesome. It changed my life because before I had that, I had no access to any information. And after that was made available, I suddenly had access to everything. So I cannot speak enough about this. This is a wonderful, wonderful service that should be used everywhere in public meetings and town meetings in particular. So one thing that Ali and I and Noel talked about was creating synergistic partnerships between yourself and other offices in the town so that you can share resources, not just technologically, but also cost-wise. So if you're going to have a program that addresses, say, accessibility in the town, have the library hosted, have town government pay for the access, that kind of thing. You all pool your resources, you pay for captioning, you come up with joint programs. I will say the captioning is much more useful in probably 95% of all situations than ASL, simply because of the sheer imbalance between the very small number of culturally deaf people and the very large number of hard of hearing people out there. And again, that depends a lot on where you are. If you're in Framingham, where there's the Learning Center for Deaf, you might have many deaf people. If you're in Danvers, you're going to have many deaf people. But outside of those areas, you're going to have mostly hard of hearing people. So you do have to kind of think about that a little bit. And this is automatic speech recognition. I wanted to show to you quickly. I have it on my phone. And again, you have it on your phones. If you have Apple iPhones, you have it under hearing assistance. You have it under I think it's called live caption, and then you can select the microphone, and then you could, in theory, point your phone towards somebody and then just speak, and it's going to come across in English. If you have somebody who is Spanish and who is hard of hearing, and you have a Spanish-speaking library staff, the library employee could speak in Spanish and it could represent in Spanish. Of course, you would have to be able to understand the person speaking back to you. But this is a great tool. It's free. Most people have it. It's not something you should be using for a public event or for projection or for in place of captioning, because makes a lot of mistakes still. It hallucinates and sometimes it stops. Now, with a card provider, when something goes wrong, I can fix it. They can fix it. I can fix it. When automatic captioning doesn't work, what are you going to do? You're going to call Google? You're going to call Apple? That's not likely to happen. So that's one of the reasons why I don't recommend that. It's not nearly as good as live captioning. Now, for deaf-blind, almost done. We're getting there. We're getting there. For deaf-blind individuals, you really have to work with a deaf-blind person because there's a vast array of what we call deaf-blind people. The most deaf-blind people that I know, they use tactile American Sign Language. Most deaf-blind people I know learned ASL before they became completely blind. So they were deaf and then they became blind. That's most of the people that I know. And so how do they get information from ASL interpreters? So if you're saying something, the ASL interpreter is going to be standing or sitting very close to the deaf-blind person, and he's going to be signing in a much smaller frame, and the deaf-blind person is going to have the hands on top of the interpreter's hands and be able to read from the hand shapes what's being said to them. And then when they communicate to you what they're saying, they are going to sign, and the interpreter is going to voice. But not everybody uses that. Some people do have some hearing and may ask for amplification systems, and some deaf-blind people do have some limited vision where they might ask for captioning. The only drawback that we found out from having staff like that on board with us is the bigger you make caption, the faster they go across the screen, which means if you have somebody who's requesting big captions, you may need to do other things like talk a lot slower so the captions don't go whistling so fast that somebody can't see them. And some people use what's called, I can't think the name of it right now. Oh my gosh. Oh yes, it's right in front of me. Boy, I'm running out of steam. Telebrailers, where basically you can take a cart output, imagine that, from a cart provider, and you can put it into a telebraille, which is a refreshing braille display. And the deafblind person who knows braille, which to be honest, is not that many people know anymore, but they can put their fingers on top of the refreshing braille display and read the text that is being sent. So that is an option. But again, you have to talk to the individual and find out what they want. Finally, last couple of slides. You need to make your library also physically accessible. People need to know what's going on. You need to have visual fire alarms. Um, I would recommend that in today's uncertain world, if you have any kind of emergency alerting system, you make people aware of what that is or how they can sign up for it. Or I think at least like I said, give trainings to law enforcement, and I've actually talked to people about what do you do during active shooter protocols, and they all kind of looked at me more like, we never thought of that. How do you make deaf and hard of hearing people aware that something's happening in their environment? Because I want to know that. I want to know as much as the next person what goes around me. So at least have some conversations about that. If it's a cellular-based system, give people share that with people. Not everybody knows that they can sign up for town-wide alerts or city-wide alerts, because that's why they go to the library. They learn stuff at the library. They find out stuff from you. So share that information with people. Maybe have somebody come in, maybe do a presentation about safety in general. Talk about fire alarms. Most deaf people and most hard of hearing people have no clue that there is such a thing as fire alarms that will shake your bed to wake you up and flash a strobe. I got people calling me day in, day out, asking me for all sorts of technology, and nobody ever asks about fire alarms. And matter of fact, the fire alarm you see in the bottom right corner this here, which is called the HL Life Tone, it is not per se a fire alarm. It listens for the sound of an existing fire alarm, which can be a battery-operated T3 detector, which goes beep, beep, beep. And when it hears that, it will activate the little disc you see next to it, which is a bed shaker, which goes between the mattress and the box spring. And guess what? That is available free of charge from the American Red Cross. So if you want information about that, feel free to email me. I will be happy to send you the contact name and the information on how to get that. But again, people don't even know this stuff exists, which drives me crazy. We have people out there in the community and we don't know who they are. You are actually more likely to find out who these people are than we are. And all this technology is available and they may not know what it is or where to get it. So, and I've talked about that already. Here's some resources. We do not recommend anyone in particular. This is just a random collection of stuff that I put together that I use frequently. I look at it frequently, and it will be mind-blowing to you, I think, when you see all the technology that's available for deaf and hard of hearing people. So please take a look at that. And again, if you want me to come into your library and do a library program or have another virtual library program where we talk about specific items that we've highlighted in today's presentation, I would be happy to do that with you. Let me see. Finally, something that most people really don't realize, you all know what seeing eye dogs for the blind are. Well, most people don't realize there's something called hearing ear dogs that fulfill a similar mission for people with hearing loss. They are trained to notify deaf and hard of hearing people the presence of sound, which can be very helpful because very often you're moving in between environments where there's no alerting. You've got no idea that an ambulance is coming down the street or that a truck is blaring its horn or something like that. Or you can be sitting in an inaccessible bathroom doing your business as a deaf person because, newsflash, deaf people go to the bathroom. And let's say there is no strobe inside the bathroom. If the alarm goes off in the building, everybody will be evacuated instead of me. I'm going to be sitting in the bathroom doing my business. I have no idea that the fire alarm's going off because I can't hear it and there's no strobe in the bathroom. So if I have a dog like that with me, the dog will act out and I will know something's going on. I need to finish my business and I need to find out what's going on. So these dogs are covered by the same laws as seeing eye dogs and allowed anywhere. However, you cannot ask for proof of identification. You can't say, show me your license for the hearing aid dog. It's the same thing as with service animals. You have to take the person's word for the fact that this is a service animal unless you see that the animal is poorly behaved, out of control, and all of that stuff, because then you can say, I'm sorry, but this doesn't not appear to be a service animal. And I believe that that was my last slide, and there's my contact information, and Ali is going like this. He actually is going to be quiet now. He's going to turn it over to other people. Wow. So, any questions? Allie, up to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. And really, you are an impressive and valuable resource. And I'm so happy you were here today. And I'm so happy you and Noel kicked off this Core Connection series. It really was a fabulous presentation. We have about 12 minutes. So if people have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or unmute yourself and ask. The time is yours right now.
And I did just want to add one thing I forgot about to mention in my little mini presentation was, and I'm going to say, what was I going to talk about? Oh, signage. Jonathan and I talked about this before, but then I forgot to mention it in my presentation was, have really good, accurate signage in your building. I know that we do for in general, but like, make sure you do, right? Because a lot of people who are have a disability, but they can read, like, that's going to be makes things easier for them to be able to get around and do things that they need to do. So signage, I meant to mention signage. So that's another easy thing for us to be able to do to help.
And
Jonathan,
no,
I
there's no fee
will.
for me. What some of the good things in life are free, and I'm one of them.
So that answers question number one. And then the next question is for smaller towns with small budgets, what is the number one intervention resource you would recommend we pursue?
I personally would go for, if you're talking just for library services, I would say that you do a trial program. So, for example, now I'm kind of very nervous about saying this because I'm just creating a lot of work for myself. But one of the things you can do is if you could partner with a couple of other towns, like regional, I could not possibly do it at every single library. But what I could do is I could do a version of this presentation, but aimed towards hard of hearing people, because many hard of hearing people don't know what to do about their own hearing loss. So I actually have done this in some libraries and some councils on aging. I've given presentations on hearing loss. And when I give a presentation, I have to make myself accessible, don't I? So then I have to bring captioning with me, which is part of my role and part of my function, which the Commonwealth of Massachusetts pays for. And then instead of pointing the captioning towards me, I simply put it on a large monitor and point it towards the audience, so the audience and I can both understand what we are saying. So that might be one way of starting to introduce people. The other thing that I often say is if you have town meetings, advocate that your town meeting provide a captioner, because that's the really important part. A town meeting should have a representation in it from all the people, not just the hearing people. And if you look at the audience of a typical town meeting, there's a lot of silver-haired people who might have difficulty hearing. Advocate for card captioning to be provided, and then ask people afterward, what did you think of it? Because you will get the support you need, because everywhere I've seen that happen, everybody says, we loved it, it's phenomenal, we went to this at every meeting, and which has helped towns make it more available. Does that make sense at all?
It, it does to me, and I'll see if there's a follow-up to that. Oh, there might makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you. And then the question from Catherine, does a list already exist of library demonstration sites for assistive technology? Catherine, I think the question you're asking is like, do we have essentially a directory of what libraries provide assistive technology? And the answer to that is no, we don't have like a comprehensive list. Um, it is something, Jonathan, I know I talked to you about this in one of our like meetings weeks ago, about generating. It would take, some legwork to get the feedback from all the libraries, but yeah, to create some type of directory so you know where assistive technology exists and what exists.
I think there is some that I'm aware of. I think there's the Forbes Library in Northampton. We talked about that. Is one that has it. I think Chicopee has some things. Obviously, Noel's library has some things. I've been to a couple of other libraries that have Individual things, I think, oh my God, I think it's Lowell or Lawrence. I keep forgetting which one it is, which is terribly embarrassing to me. Actually, they listened to me and they provided a implementation of a video phone, realizing that not all deaf people are housed. They decided that they were going to implement the provision of a public video phone, which is actually ridiculously easy and which is actually something that the service provider would pay for. You would just have to provide a location and internet access. But there are individual communities who do that. We just have not yet had a directory, which I think would be a great thing to work on.
Yeah, and it is on my 2026 to-do list to create this directory. And this just circles me back to Jonathan, something we talked about in the very beginning of signing on here. When you talk about services to people who are deaf and hard of hearing, as well as digital literacy. So if your library provides assistive, adaptive technology, making sure that that's easy to find, not only on your website, but like Noelle said, like in your library too. I know when I've gone on certain websites to try and find like, oh, do they have anything? You're like combing through, or it might not even exist on there. So if you're somebody like we were talking about, like aging and older populations who are like trying to navigate a website and they're trying to see if you have something, like make sure it's like very easy to get to and promote it. And that goes back to something you said in the very beginning, like if you have these services, you have these tools and technology, promote it, make sure that people know that you have it. And sometimes that, that'll take a little bit of work and effort, but put it out there.
And if I may add, I remember when I think maybe one of the first times I saw you present, Jonathan, one of the things you said is if you do have something, put a sign on your door, your front door that says, in here we have X. And like, so like on our door, our entries into the building, like I have a little sign, that says, and particularly talks about the counter loop system and be like, just go to any service desk, for this. And I think it's, it's important to be able to, you just need some signage. And I think you had said at that time, at that presentation, like and this one too, like you're so used to not having services that like when you see something that like, you're like, oh, hey, there's a service available, you're going to note it. And then you're going to, maybe even spread the word about it yourselves to others that like that library or location has something.
And I would add to that, Noel, great point. I would add to that, be as generic as possible. Don't say we've got a counter loop. You can explain that later. Explain we have something that can help people hear better. That, because if you say we have a counter loop, people are not going to know what that is. And okay, counter loop, I'm not interested in that, and walk off because they have no idea what that is. And the other thing, I think I mentioned this in the RSVPs. If you send out RSVPs, if you send out event flyers, and again, you're going to get this in my presentation, but I cannot overstate the importance of that. Give an email, not just a phone number. Give an email where people can reach you and say, I want this, that, or the other thing. And then mention for each event what you are already providing. And then add something to language that says, if you need other accommodations, such as ASL interpreter or a captioner or something, please let us know by. And as Noel said, it's hard to get people with a minute's notice. So give us as much advance notice as you can, and we will do our best to provide somebody to you.
And I can say too that if anybody here uses Assabet for their programs and events and things like that too, they just added a brand new little functionality under, I think, their miscellaneous settings, which I asked them. I was the one who asked them to do it, and they did it. That you can have boilerplate language added to any of your event listings or your meeting rooms or whatever like that. So like I always have a statement that says, the library is not responsible for the content of like what's presented in these meetings or whatever. But, and this is a good point, Jonathan, but you can add a statement like that, so every single time you put up a program listing, you can have something that says, if you need accommodations for this program, please contact, this. So, and it could just be, you don't even have to think about it because you're just clicking once you've set it up in Assabet, it's just a click onto that form that you fill out every time. So there's a lot of easy ways to do that without a lot of work.
Okay, and there's just to kind of clean up the chat here, there's a really good resource that's coming out of it's from ALA's I'm sorry, it's just the Bridging Deaf Cultures, an ALA interest group. And there's when you click on the link, it takes you to a Google Doc with a lot of different resources. And it looks like it is maybe organized by Brad McKenna. So I'm trying to go through like the different messages.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So so that's something to check out too. And I will include that. I'm going to share out a link to the recording, the slides, and any of these resources that are shared in the chat so people can spend more time with them looking through. So thanks for sharing that. Um, and then the other question was about tapping into the Massachusetts Municipal Association in order to advocate for town meetings to provide assistive services to the deaf and hard of hearing.
Yeah, I actually gave a presentation with them not too long ago where we had municipal access coordinators join, where I mentioned pretty much the same thing that I'm mentioning here today, the importance of, making the services accessible. The the problem, of course, with town meetings, the one thing that's a challenge is that everybody tends to have the meetings around the same time. So I can tell you personally, again, my wife is a captioner. One of the challenges she faces that I imagine every other captioner faces is most of these town meetings have to be done in person. They are too complicated, and the town doesn't want to do it remotely. Although, not being totally crazy, but I could help some towns figure out how to do it remotely. Boy, am I making work for myself. But the point being that there are only X number of captioners. I think in New England area we have maybe 12 captioners. Yeah, imagine that. Maybe 12, 13 that I am aware of that actually go places. Because one of the things we struggle with as an agency is that everything can be done remote these days. So a lot of interpreters and a lot of card providers are a lot less willing to go somewhere because they don't necessarily get paid for the travel time and it's inconvenient. And if they can do it remotely, they'll do it remotely. So for those of you who are interested in how you could provide some remote access, I can help you figure that out. That's a whole different discussion. But one of the challenges we have is that town meetings tend to be in the same 2 or 3 week span all across the Commonwealth. And then people have like, where do we go? Because we have 20 people asking 2 people to cover them all at the same time. So that's one of the real challenges we have.
Well, it's 3:30. Jonathan, and Noel, you've spent so much of your afternoon with us, and we really appreciate it. And thank you for all the insight and experience. And thank you to everyone who attended today. It was a really great presentation and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us. Have a great afternoon, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, everybody.